The sea went flat in less than a minute, and that was when I knew someone on the rig was about to die. I remember gripping the railing, staring at the horizon, trying to understand how waves that tall could simply vanish, like they had been switched off. They never taught us how to explain it, only how to survive it, and that was where the rules came in. There are 11 strange rules. Every storm watcher is drilled on before their first overnight shift. Rules they tell you not to question and never to break. I laughed at them once, right before I broke one by accident. The calm came early that night, and I still don't know if it noticed me first or if I noticed it. The first time this happened, I was standing alone in the observation tower, staring at the monitors while rain still fell straight down around the rig. Wind readings dropped so fast the graph looked broken and the ocean below turned smooth, like glass poured across the surface. I reached for the radio to report it, because that was my job, and that was when I remembered Rule 1. If the sea becomes calm while the storm warning is still active, do not announce it over the radio. My hand froze inches from the transmit button, and for the first time since joining the rig, I felt like the rules weren't about safety anymore. They were about staying unnoticed. The calm didn't feel peaceful the way quiet seas usually do after a storm passes. It felt tight, like the air itself was holding still, as if movement might trigger something beneath us. The rig lights reflected perfectly off the water, creating a mirror so clear it made my stomach twist when I looked down. Storms are loud, violent, and chaotic, but this silence felt organized, deliberate. I kept glancing between the live feed and the horizon, waiting for something to explain itself. Nothing did. I checked the time logs to make sure the system hadn't glitched, but every alert still showed active warnings. Waves were supposed to be hitting the pylons hard enough to shake the lower decks, yet the structure barely moved. My headset crackled with routine chatter from inside the rig, unaware that the ocean had changed its mind. I imagined what would happen if I said something. How many people would rush to windows and railings. The idea made my chest tighten, and I stayed quiet. That was when I noticed the surface wasn't just calm, it was perfectly level. No ripples, no current lines, nothing drifting except the rain that vanished the moment it touched the water. I leaned closer to the glass, trying to see if it was an illusion caused by lighting or exhaustion. The reflection stared back at me, sharp and steady, like the sea wanted to be seen clearly. I stepped back without realizing it, suddenly aware of how exposed the tower felt. I told myself I was overthinking it, that fatigue does strange things during long storm watches. Still, my training screamed at me to report anomalies, because unreported data gets people hurt. The rules had never explained why silence mattered, only that it did. I paced the small room, boots echoing softly against the metal floor as the storm alarms blinked on untouched screens. Every instinct pulled me toward the radio, and every warning inside me pushed me away. Minutes passed, then longer stretches that felt wrong in their slowness. The storm outside the perimeter should have been violent, yet here it was like the rig existed in a bubble. I watched water run down the glass in thin lines, stopping cleanly where the ocean began. My reflection looked pale and distorted, like someone else wearing my face. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep observing instead of speaking. That was when I noticed movement far below the surface, not fast, not dramatic, but steady. It wasn't a shape I could define, more like the absence of reflection in one place where reflection should have been. The darkness beneath the rig seemed deeper than usual, as if the lights couldn't reach it anymore. I adjusted the camera feed, but the image blurred, refusing to focus where I needed it most. My heart started racing, and I backed away from the console. Inside the rig, life continued like nothing was wrong. Crew members joked over the internal channel. Someone complained about coffee running out, and another asked when the storm would finally pass. I realized that if I broke silence, I would change that normalcy instantly. Whatever this was, it felt like it preferred us unaware. The calm stretched on, unnatural and heavy, pressing against the structure like a held breath. I stayed silent, even as fear crawled up my spine. The longer I watched, the more the ocean felt less like water and more like a surface covering something else. I couldn't shake the sense that if I spoke, the balance would shift. The observation tower suddenly felt too high, too open, like I was standing on display. I lowered the lights inside the room, hoping to disappear from whatever might be looking up. My hands shook as I wrote notes instead of sending reports. Then the internal line chimed, and Control asked why my station hadn't checked in. I stared at the blinking indicator, knowing they were waiting for my voice. My mouth went dry as I tried to decide which choice was worse, silence or explanation. The calm outside didn't move, didn't ripple, didn't change at all. And as I hesitated, something beneath the surface slowly began to rise. Whatever was coming up didn't break the surface right away, and that delay made it worse. The water stayed perfectly smooth, while a darker shape pushed upward from below, stretching the reflection until it warped the lights of the rig. I leaned closer to the glass without realizing it, trying to understand depth and distance. And that was when Rule 2. If something rises beneath the rig during calm seas, do not look directly into the water for more than 5 seconds surfaced in my mind, like a memory that didn't belong to me. I counted in my head as panic crept in. Unsure if I had already stared too long, my eyes burned as if I had been holding them open underwater. I pulled back sharply and pressed my shoulder against the wall, forcing myself to look anywhere else. The tower suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had crept inward while I wasn't paying attention. I focused on the instrument panel, on numbers and indicators that still insisted the storm was raging outside our perimeter. Nothing on the screens explained the massive presence pressing up beneath us. The contradiction made my thoughts feel slippery, like they refused to settle. My training told me to observe, to document anomalies clearly and calmly. At the same time, every instinct I had screamed that observation itself was the danger. I glanced at the glass again for just a moment, careful not to linger, and saw the darkness shift closer to the surface. It wasn't shaped like debris or rock, and it didn't move like anything caught in a current. It felt intentional, as if it knew exactly where the tower was positioned above it. The control room called again, their voices tight now, asking why my feed showed abnormal readings. I answered with half-truths, talking about sensor lag and visual distortion caused by rain and lighting. Even as I spoke, I felt like the words were being weighed by something outside, measured for honesty or threat. The darkness below pulsed faintly, not through motion, but through presence. I ended the transmission early, claiming interference. I tried to step away from the window entirely, but the sense of being watched followed me. The glass reflected my face back at me, pale and tense, eyes darting despite my effort to stay focused. I wondered how many seconds I had already spent looking down since the shape appeared. The rule didn't say what would happen if I went over, only that I shouldn't. That omission felt deliberate, like the worst part wasn't meant to be spoken. A memory surfaced then, something a senior watcher had said during my first week. He'd been drunk, leaning against the railing, staring out at the sea with a look that didn't match his smile. He told me the ocean doesn't like being stared at when it's pretending to sleep. I laughed at the time, assuming it was just another superstition passed down to scare newcomers. Standing there now, I realized superstition and survival often wear the same face. The shape beneath the rig edged closer, close enough that I could see where light bent around it. The water still didn't ripple, didn't react the way it should have to displacement. My chest felt tight, breath shallow, as if the air pressure inside the tower was shifting along with the sea below. I sat down hard in the chair, forcing my gaze onto the floor. Even with my eyes averted, I could feel its position in my mind. Inside the rig, alarms flickered briefly before stabilizing again, dismissed by automated systems as false readings. Someone laughed over the internal channel, complaining about machines acting up during storms. I wanted to shout at them to stay away from the windows, to trust me without explanation. Instead, I stayed silent, afraid that drawing attention would invite curiosity. Curiosity, I was beginning to understand, was the real enemy. The calm stretched on far longer than it should have, turning minutes into something heavier. My skin prickled with the sense that time itself was slowing around the rig. I risked another glance downward, counting silently, forcing myself to stop before panic took over. The darkness was closer now, its edge defined not by shape but by absence, like a hole punched through the sea. It felt less like something rising, and more like something waiting to be acknowledged. My console chimed with a system notification, and I jumped despite myself. The automated report suggested deploying additional cameras to investigate the anomaly below. I stared at the suggestion, horrified at how casually the system treated whatever this was. Sending more eyes down there felt like offering it attention, multiplying the risk instead of understanding it. I canceled the prompt and wiped sweat from my palms onto my pants. The tower lights flickered briefly, dimming before returning to normal. In that brief dip, the reflection on the water vanished, and for a split second I saw depth that didn't make sense. It wasn't endless, but layered, like stacked spaces descending far beyond what the sea should allow. My stomach twisted as the lights came back, sealing the view behind glass and glare. I turned away, heart pounding, knowing I had pushed my luck. I tried grounding myself by thinking practically, listing procedures and contingencies. Storm watchers are trained to expect fear, to function through it, but this felt different. This wasn't danger rushing toward us, it was patience. The thing below didn't need to hurry, because it already had us where it wanted us. That realization made my hands tremble harder than the storm ever had. The internal channel erupted with raised voices, as someone on the lower deck reported unusual shadows beneath the rig. I closed my eyes, dread pooling in my chest, knowing attention was spreading whether I liked it or not. Once multiple people start looking, control demands explanations, and explanations lead to panic. Panic leads to mistakes. I pressed my headset tighter against my ear, listening as confusion rippled through the crew. Then the rig shuddered, not violently, but firmly, like a warning rather than an impact. Equipment rattled softly around me, and the darkness beneath shifted closer still. I felt the vibration through the soles of my boots, slow and deliberate. My mind raced ahead to rules I hoped we wouldn't need tonight. As the calm sea held steady, and the shape pressed upward, I realized this was only the beginning. The shudder ran through the tower again, stronger this time, and I grabbed the edge of the console to steady myself. Nothing outside changed. No waves, no spray, no visible disturbance on the surface, which made the movement feel deeply wrong. That was when Rule 3, if the rig shakes while the sea remains calm, assume the structure is not what is moving, forced its way into my thoughts, sharp and unwanted. The implications settled in slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. Whatever caused that movement wasn't the rig reacting to the sea, but the sea reacting to something else. I waited for another tremor, trying to convince myself it had been a delayed response to wind or shifting weight. The monitors showed stable readings across every structural sensor, no stress spikes, no warnings, nothing that justified what I felt under my boots. That contradiction made my skin crawl more than the movement itself. I realized I was holding my breath, afraid to inhale too loudly in the small tower. The calm outside felt less like weather, and more like restraint. Voices on the internal channel grew sharper as reports came in from multiple decks. Someone mentioned feeling the rig tilt slightly before correcting itself, while another insisted something brushed past the pylons below. Control tried to calm everyone down, blaming stress and storm fatigue, but I could hear the doubt creeping into their voices. I stayed silent, knowing that explaining would only make things worse. Once the idea takes root that the rig isn't stable, panic spreads faster than fire. Another deep movement passed through the structure, slower and more deliberate than the last. It didn't jolt us, didn't threaten collapse, but carried weight, like pressure being tested. I pictured the rig from the outside, towering metal legs disappearing into black water. The thought that something might be shifting around those supports made my stomach twist. I backed away from the window without turning my back on it. I forced myself to focus on routine checks, anything to anchor my thoughts. Structural integrity logs, ballast levels, and anchor tension all read normal. Everything insisted we were safe, that the rig hadn't moved at all. That was the worst part, realizing the systems weren't lying, just blind. They only knew how to measure what they were built to expect. A message from engineering flashed across my console, asking if I felt the vibration too. I hesitated before responding, choosing my words carefully. I told them it felt like residual movement from earlier weather shifts, something to monitor but not escalate. Even as I sent it, guilt settled heavy in my chest. I was hiding something without fully understanding why. The calm sea reflected the rig perfectly now, so clear it felt staged. I noticed that the reflection didn't distort when the rig shook again, which meant the water wasn't reacting at all. That realization sent a chill through me. If the sea wasn't moving, then the reference point for that shaking had to be somewhere else. Somewhere below, my thoughts drifted to the base of the rig, to the dark zone where light thins and cameras struggle. Those supports were designed to withstand pressure and current, not in tension. I imagined something large adjusting itself around them, testing balance and resistance. The image made my throat tighten. I wiped my hands on my jacket, suddenly aware they were trembling. Control announced a temporary lockdown of exterior access points as a precaution. Crew members grumbled, frustrated, but compliant, unaware of how close they might have been to the water moments earlier. I listened as procedures rolled out, each one designed for storms, not for this. The gap between protocol and reality felt dangerously wide. I wondered how many rules were written, because someone once failed to follow them. The tower shook again, enough this time to rattle loose items across the floor. I steadied myself against the wall, heart hammering as I waited for alarms that never came. The movement stopped abruptly, leaving behind a heavy stillness. It felt like something had finished checking us. That thought made my blood run cold. A crew member on the lower deck reported a sensation of pressure against the hull, like standing too close to something massive. Control dismissed it as stress, but the channel went quiet afterward. No one joked anymore. The rig lights flickered faintly, then stabilized, casting long reflections across the unmoving sea. I avoided looking at those reflections for too long. I found myself wondering how many times the rig had shaken before in past storms without anyone questioning it. How often had movement been blamed on weather when something else was responsible? The rules suddenly felt less like superstition and more like records of survival, each one a lesson paid for by someone who didn't make it back. That realization settled heavily in my chest. The calm outside refused to break, holding firm despite every warning and expectation. I checked the time again, and realized far too long had passed since the last real wave. My headset buzzed as Control requested another status update from my station. I stared at the microphone, weighing honesty against fear. Before I could respond, the rig shifted once more, slower than before, as if settling into a new position. This time the movement didn't stop. The movement finally stopped, but the stillness afterward felt heavier than anything before it. I stood frozen in the tower, waiting for the sensation of motion to fade, yet my balance felt subtly wrong, like the floor had learned a new angle. That was when Rule 4. If the rig settles into a new position during a calm sea, do not attempt to measure the depth beneath it surfaced in my mind, uninvited and sharp. The rule felt less like advice, and more like a warning meant to arrive too late. I stared at the depth readouts on my console, knowing exactly which button would tell me how far the water now fell below us. Storm watchers are trained to confirm positioning after any significant movement. It is written into every manual, drilled into muscle memory until hesitation feels like failure. The idea of not checking depth went against everything I had learned, which made the rule feel deliberately cruel. I told myself there was nothing to gain from ignorance, that numbers would ground me. At the same time, a quiet part of me insisted that some measurements are invitations. The depth sensors sat idle, waiting for input, their screens dark but ready. I could already imagine the data scrolling in neat lines, clean and comforting in its certainty. The rig had been anchored at this location for years, its depth logged and verified countless times. A slight shift shouldn't have changed anything enough to matter. Still, the sense that the space beneath us had rearranged itself refused to leave. I stepped closer to the console and rested my hand near the controls without touching them. The calm sea outside reflected the rig at a new angle, now subtle but unmistakable. It was the kind of change you only notice once something feels off, impossible to unsee afterward. My reflection in the glass looked distorted, stretched slightly longer than it should have been. I stepped back again, heart beating faster. Control broke the silence over the internal channel, asking if my station could confirm the rig's current depth. Their tone was controlled, but tight, the kind of calm that comes from holding worry just out of reach. I swallowed and told them I was running diagnostics, buying time without giving answers. Lying felt wrong, but telling the truth felt worse. The rules never explained how to explain themselves to people who didn't believe in them. I tried to reason with myself, breaking the situation down into manageable parts. The rig had shifted, but anchors and supports were designed to handle minor adjustments. Sensors showed no structural damage, no loss of integrity, no immediate danger. Everything insisted we were safe, stable, and exactly where we should be. And yet the rule existed, which meant someone once learned otherwise. A memory surfaced of a debrief I had skimmed during training, a report marked restricted and incomplete. It mentioned a rig that had resettled during a storm and a crew that insisted the ocean floor had changed beneath them. The conclusion blamed equipment malfunction and stress-induced hallucination. The crew was never reassigned offshore. At the time I had assumed it was bureaucracy being cautious. Now it felt like erasure. The longer I avoided the measurement, the more Control pressed for answers. Engineers wanted numbers, coordinates, something solid to reassure the crew. I could hear frustration creeping into their voices, the kind that turns into risky decisions. If I didn't provide data, someone else would try to get it another way. That thought scared me more than the depth itself. I imagined sending a drone down, watching it descend through black water until its lights faded. I imagined the counter ticking steadily at first, then slowing, then behaving strangely. The rule didn't say the depth would be dangerous, only that measuring it was. That distinction felt important, like the danger wasn't in the distance, but in the act of knowing. Knowledge, in this case, felt like exposure. The rig remained still, too still, as if it had settled into something rather than onto something. I paced the small tower, boots heavy against the floor, trying to release nervous energy without drawing attention. The calm sea outside made time feel thick, stretched like it resisted moving forward. Every second I delayed felt both reckless and necessary. I checked the time again and realized far too much of it had passed without a decision. Control escalated their request, routing it through official channels instead of casual conversation. The wording changed from asking to instructing, and I felt the weight of authority press down on me. I pictured crew members waiting on lower decks, trusting that someone somewhere understood what was happening. The responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. I had never felt more alone in a room full of people. I hovered over the activation switch again, fingers trembling. Part of me hoped the system would fail, that a glitch would save me from choosing. It didn't. The console waited patiently, indifferent to fear or consequence. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, trying to listen to something deeper than training. When I opened them, the reflection on the water had changed again. It no longer lined up perfectly with the rig above it, as if the sea was showing me a version that lagged behind reality. The space between image and structure made my head ache. I stepped away from the glass, suddenly afraid of how easily my sense of scale could be manipulated. The ocean has always been good at that. I finally responded to Control, telling them I couldn't confirm depth due to sensor recalibration. It was a thin excuse, but it bought me silence. The channel went quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than relieved. I knew they were discussing next steps without me. That meant decisions were being made. The rig shifted again, not violently, but decisively, like something finishing a careful adjustment. My balance corrected instinctively, confirming that the structure had accepted this new position as stable. Outside, the sea remained calm, unbroken, and watching, I felt a sudden certainty that the depth below us was no longer what it had been an hour ago. I backed away from the console completely, pressing myself against the far wall. Measuring now felt less like curiosity and more like trespassing. Whatever had moved us wanted the space beneath to remain undefined. The rules weren't there to protect us from the sea, I realized. They were there to protect the sea from us. As if in response to my thought, an alert flashed across my screen from another station. Someone else had initiated a depth check from a lower deck console. My heart dropped as the system acknowledged the request. The process had begun, whether I wanted it or not. And as the numbers started to populate on the shared network, the calm outside finally began to change. The moment the shared network lit up with live depth data, a wave of dread passed through me that had nothing to do with the storm. I stared at the edge of my console, refusing to let my eyes drift upward, because Rule 5, if someone measures the depth anyway, do not watch the numbers as they change, pressed itself into my thoughts like a command I had always known. Somewhere below, a machine was sending pulses downward and waiting for them to return. I imagined the signal traveling through water that no longer behaved like water. Knowing it was happening made my skin crawl. Voices flooded the internal channel as engineers gathered around their screens. Some sounded relieved to finally have data, while others grew quiet as the first readings appeared. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, focusing on the pattern of wear marks near my boots. Even without looking, I could sense the hesitation in their voices, the pauses between words growing longer. Numbers have a way of changing how people speak. Someone asked if the sensor was malfunctioning, laughing nervously, as if humor could flatten uncertainty. Another replied that calibration looked fine, that the readings were technically possible, just unlikely. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to look despite the pull it exerted on my attention. Curiosity tugged at me harder than fear, and that terrified me most. The rule wasn't about eyesight, I realized, but about restraint. The calm outside finally fractured, not into waves, but into something subtler. The reflection on the water wavered, stretching and compressing, as if the surface were adjusting to new information. I stayed where I was, afraid that even glancing at the numbers would anchor them in reality. The idea settled into my mind that observation didn't just record changes, it completed them. A sharp intake of breath came through the channel as someone finally said the depth out loud. They stopped halfway through the number, voice trailing off into silence. Control demanded clarification, their tone tight with authority and fear. No one answered right away. That silence carried more weight than any reading could. I pressed my palms flat against the wall, grounding myself in the cold metal. My heart pounded hard enough that I worried it might carry through the structure. I wondered who had authorized the depth check, and whether they were watching the screen now. The rule never said the person who measured it would be the one to suffer. It just warned those who watched. The rig seemed to respond to the spoken number, settling slightly, as if acknowledging being named. My balance shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Several voices broke into panicked chatter, arguing about whether the data made sense. Someone suggested rerunning the scan. The idea made my stomach twist. Control cut through the noise, ordering everyone to stay calm and await further analysis. Their words felt thin, stretched too tight over something massive and unseen. I imagined the depth below us expanding or contracting, not as a physical change, but as a correction. Like the ocean had been miscounted until now. I wondered what number it preferred, against my better judgment. I glanced at the edge of my console, catching only a fragment of the display before looking away. The digits blurred in my mind immediately, refusing to settle into a clear memory. That alone frightened me more than seeing something impossible. It felt like my mind had rejected the information on instinct, as if remembering it was dangerous. A low murmur spread through the rig as word traveled faster than official channels could contain it. Crew members speculated quietly, voices edged with fear they tried to hide. Someone laughed too loudly, another snapped at them to be quiet. The storm outside remained strangely distant, like it was waiting for us to finish something first. That thought made my skin prickle. I heard my name over the channel, control asking if I had visual confirmation of the sea state. I swallowed hard before answering, keeping my response clipped and technical. I told them the surface was unstable and changing, which felt true without explaining why. They acknowledged and moved on, but the tension lingered. Everyone could feel it now. The depth reading process finally stopped, either manually or because the system refused to continue. No one explained which. The silence that followed felt brittle, like glass waiting to break. I pushed myself away from the wall and finally dared to look out the window again. The sea was no longer calm. The surface had begun to distort, not violently, but unevenly, as if depth itself were trying to surface. Light bent strangely across it, creating lines that didn't match the rig's shape anymore. I realized then that the measurement hadn't just revealed something below us. It had changed our relationship to it, and as the first real wave rolled toward the rig, I understood we had crossed a boundary we couldn't uncross. The first towering swell appeared, where the sea had been perfectly still a moment ago, stretching skyward in silence and shadow. I froze, hand resting on the glass, feeling the floor of the tower tremble beneath me in anticipation. That was when Rule 6, if a wave rises without wind or tide, do not assume it is natural, surged into my mind, warning me that explanation could kill. I couldn't measure it, touch it, or communicate it without consequence. All I could do was watch, heart hammering, as something impossible began to take shape beneath the surface. The wave moved like a living thing, curving with intention rather than force, defying gravity in ways water should not. My stomach churned, realizing that nothing in my training accounted for this behavior. Engineers on the lower decks were calling up, asking if I saw the same anomaly, their voices shaking with disbelief. I whispered to myself, promising not to look too long, not to linger, but every instinct wanted to fix my eyes on it. The calm I had trusted moments ago felt like a lie, and I wondered how long lies could exist at sea. I felt the rig respond, tilting slightly as if acknowledging the water's unnatural movement. Floor panels shifted subtly under my boots, supporting the notion that the foundation itself was negotiating with the wave. My mind raced, trying to calculate physics, currents, and pressure, but none applied. The water's behavior mocked logic entirely. Every nerve in my body screamed that this was not a storm or a trick of light. Voices erupted on the internal channel, crew members speculating wildly about underwater explosions or tectonic activity. Control tried to calm everyone, instructing them to monitor systems, but I knew they had no frame of reference for what was unfolding. The wave's rise was deliberate, measured, and wrong. I pressed my face closer to the glass, even as Rule 6 reminded me not to assume safety. Ignorance, I realized, was the only temporary shield. The swell continued to grow, folding in on itself and creating patterns that seemed familiar in shape, but impossible in scale. I backed away, trying to maintain distance while keeping peripheral vision on it. My thoughts scattered between disbelief and calculation, each conflicting with the other. Even with my training, even with years of experience, I felt powerless. There was no precedent, no manual, no warning that could prepare anyone for this. Control contacted me again, more urgently this time, requesting visual confirmation for safety logs. I hesitated, understanding that acknowledging it formally might amplify its presence. I tried to describe it in neutral, clinical terms, focusing on dimensions rather than behavior. The words felt inadequate, a poor shield against what my eyes were seeing. My voice faltered as I realized the wave seemed to respond to attention itself. The swell began to tower higher than any structure of the rig, bending reflections and shadows like fabric in a breeze. I remembered past warnings about calm seas, masking dangers beneath, and now I understood why. The wave wasn't a natural event, it was a signal, a test, or perhaps a barrier. I fought the urge to lean closer, each second a battle between survival instinct and curiosity. I took a step back, shoving my thoughts toward procedure rather than panic. As I monitored the wave, I noticed subtle undulations in the water surrounding it, lines and shapes that hinted at depth beyond measurement. The wave seemed to glide over them without resistance, ignoring physics entirely. I felt a heaviness pressing down from above, not from clouds or air, but from the sheer wrongness of the event. It was patient, waiting to see what we would do next. I realized that any movement on our part could provoke it further. The rig tilted again, slightly, as if the wave's presence was negotiating our balance. I braced against the railing, realizing that stability was now conditional on unseen forces below. Crew voices became frantic as they observed minor fluctuations across the rig's lower decks. Control's instructions became disjointed, a frantic attempt to regain order in the impossible situation. I stepped back from the observation window, heart pounding, knowing that this was only the beginning. I tried to focus on systems and sensors, hoping technology could give a sense of security, but instruments failed to account for what they could not measure, leaving only raw observation. My reflection stared back at me, pale, wide-eyed, trapped in a tower, watching a sea that defied reason. I understood finally that acknowledging the wave fully might be the first mistake of many. And as it hovered, enormous and silent, I realized the calm had never returned, and the ocean had claimed the rules. The rig's alarms went silent, and at first relief washed over me in a wave of disbelief. I felt the ease of calm, only to remember immediately that Rule 7. If the storm alarms stop while anomalies persist, do not assume the systems are functioning correctly. The calm was false, deceptive, like a stage set for disaster, and every monitor that displayed normal readings now felt like a lie. I stared at the control panel, its light steady and reassuring, yet my gut knew better. Something wasn't just wrong with the sea, it was wrong with everything we relied upon. I moved cautiously through the tower, checking instruments and screens while ignoring the reassuring numbers. Every graph and readout claimed equilibrium, yet the ocean below had been defying physics for hours. Crew members appeared over the intercom, asking casual questions, oblivious to what was happening beyond their vision. I wanted to warn them, but the words stuck in my throat, knowing that acknowledgement seemed to fuel the anomalies. The rules existed to protect, and ignoring them now could break more than protocol. Looking back at the water, I noticed subtle distortions along the horizon, lines bending and stretching that shouldn't have existed. The rig remained steady, but my body knew better, responding to vibrations too slight for instruments. I realized that technology, in its blind logic, had no capacity for these deviations. The alarms had stopped, but nothing else had, and the absence of warning created a tension worse than any siren. It was a void that weighed against the tower, making the air feel heavy and oppressive. I recalled conversations with veteran storm watchers, vague warnings about trusting systems blindly. They'd insisted that machines cannot account for all dangers, particularly in unusual conditions. That had seemed like an overcaution until now. The calm waters and silent instruments had conspired together to create a false sense of safety. I realized then that my only guide was intuition, raw observation, and the rules drilled into me. I focused on the horizon, where the rising swell and darkened water still lingered. The rig had shifted subtly again, not violently, but enough that my stomach registered it immediately. I watched as the reflections of the tower distorted in the glassy surface below, hinting at movements invisible to our instruments. The realization struck hard. Systems could be wrong, and now we had no backup. My chest tightened as I weighed every possible action against every potential consequence. Crew chatter over the internal channel became sporadic and nervous, voices dropping as if they too sensed the imbalance. Control issued protocol reminders, but even their carefully measured words sounded hollow against what I was witnessing. The calm beyond the rig combined with the halted alarms felt like a trap. Something was observing our reliance on technology, testing it. Every instinct screamed that we were the ones being evaluated. I walked past the consoles, glancing briefly at every screen but refusing to trust the data. Charts said equilibrium, sensors said stability, and alarms said nothing. The contradictions made my mind spin, forcing me to separate fact from what my senses insisted on. Every movement, every ripple, every subtle tilt told a story the instruments couldn't, and ignoring that story could be fatal. I pressed my palms against the cold metal walls, steadying myself, even as unease gnawed at my chest. The anomaly in the water began to change again, expanding across the horizon in shapes I couldn't name. The swell I had observed earlier grew, spreading silently, its edges warping reflections like liquid glass. I kept my eyes low, refusing to let panic take over, while the rig held a fragile balance. The calm on the instruments was a lie. The silence of alarms was deliberate, calculated, and it made everything outside feel more alive. A subtle vibration ran through the tower, soft and deliberate, almost imperceptible if I hadn't been keyed into every nuance. It was different from previous movements, slower but with a clear direction, as if the rig itself were responding to an unseen force. I froze, realizing that we were no longer observing, but interacting, trapped in a system that ignored our instruments. My hands shook against the railing, uncertain whether to brace or flee. And just as I prepared to take a step away, the water shifted again, revealing something moving just beneath the surface. The rig remained stable, the alarms remained silent, and the water began to form an unnatural outline beneath the reflection. I felt a gnawing certainty that what we were witnessing was deliberate, and that reliance on systems alone would not save us. Control's voice over the intercom sounded distant and mechanical, failing to anchor the reality before me. Every instinct told me to act cautiously, but the pressure of observation made hesitation nearly impossible. I swallowed hard, knowing the next move would define whether we survived what was coming. The shadows stretched and shifted under the surface, darker than anything I had ever seen, and moving with intention that defied natural currents. I gripped the railing tightly, feeling the tension in my arms as Rule 8. If shadows appear beneath the rig during calm water, do not assume they are normal marine life, forced itself into my mind. They weren't fish or debris, not even seaweed, but elongated, deliberate forms, sliding through the depths like they had a purpose. Every time I tried to track them with my eyes, the shapes seemed to respond, avoiding light or observation in ways that made my stomach turn. The calm had become a mask for something intelligent, something patient. I stepped closer to the observation window, forcing myself to resist leaning too far forward. The rig trembled slightly, as if acknowledging the presence beneath, subtle but impossible to ignore. Crew members were now speaking in hushed tones over the intercom, sensing the unusual without understanding it. Control demanded status updates, but my voice caught, realizing no words could adequately describe what lay below. Even describing marine life wouldn't convey intention, and intention was what scared me most. The water reflected the rig in broken, elongated streaks, as if the shadows themselves warped reality. I thought about past storms, past calm periods, and how anomalies were always dismissed by those who hadn't seen them. This time, ignoring them felt impossible. Every time I blinked, the shapes shifted, forming patterns that seemed almost communicative. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it must be something explainable, but I knew better. I leaned back, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, trying to ground myself in fact rather than fear. The shadows moved closer to the rig supports, brushing against the structure as if testing limits. Sensors showed nothing. No weight, no collision, no pressure. It was as though whatever existed below knew the instruments would lie. I shivered, realizing the calm was not just deceptive. It was a playground for something else. Control tried to reassure the crew, emphasizing that monitoring continued as normal. I listened, but every reassurance felt like a lie, too thin to cover the growing tension. The shadows weren't being watched by anyone in the room. They existed outside human perception, responding to presence and attention rather than physical stimuli. That meant they were aware, studying us as much as we were studying them. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself to take notes rather than succumb to panic. I shifted my weight and glanced at the edge of the console, imagining drawing diagrams or trying to track movement. Even with that distraction, the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, following the tilt of my head. I felt trapped in a tower that was suddenly smaller than usual, hemmed in by unseen observers. The calm of the ocean above had become a lens to focus my dread, magnifying the consequences of every movement. I realized that looking directly might provoke them, and even indirect attention carried risk. The reflections on the water's surface rippled slightly, distorting in ways inconsistent with wind or tide. I watched the shadow nearest to the rig pause, its form bending unnaturally, as if assessing me personally. My pulse quickened, understanding that these shapes were testing limits, like explorers examining unknown boundaries. The calm around the rig felt like it had hardened, pressing in from every direction, forcing me to choose between observation and survival. I resisted the instinct to reach for the radio again. Below, the shapes began moving in synchrony, forming angles and lines that could not exist naturally in water. I imagined them coiling beneath the supports, stretching farther than the light allowed me to see. A chill ran through me as I realized the rig itself had become part of their playground. They weren't just shadows, they were a presence shaping the environment around us. I stumbled backward from the window, desperate to regain composure. The internal channel fell silent, except for a few restrained coughs and shifting feet. Control's calmness sounded mechanical now, like someone reading a script rather than reacting. The rig shuddered subtly again, as if the shadows had exerted influence on its very foundations. I pressed my hands against the wall, steadying myself while my mind raced, and then I saw a shape rise toward the surface in a way no marine animal could, smooth and deliberate, like it was preparing to confront us directly. The rig pitched slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make every step unsteady and the horizon feel askew. I gripped the railing, heart hammering as Rule 9. If the rig begins to tilt for no apparent reason, do not attempt to rebalance it manually, forced itself into my mind. The movement wasn't random, and it wasn't caused by weather. The supports below responded to something beyond my comprehension. The calm sea reflected the tilt perfectly, magnifying the shift and making it feel larger than it physically was. Every instinct screamed to take action, yet the rule warned restraint. I considered the systems, the ballast, anything that might explain this subtle but growing shift. Instruments reported nothing unusual. Charts claimed stability, and alarms remained silent. My stomach churned as I realized that the rig itself had become unpredictable, and attempting manual correction might provoke forces I couldn't measure. The air felt heavy, like the tower itself was leaning with some unseen weight. Crew chatter over the internal channel grew cautious, whispers of concern threading through the formal calm. I moved toward the console cautiously, weighing the urge to override automation against the rule's warning. The tilt persisted, slow but relentless, each degree adding tension to muscles and mind alike. Outside shadows beneath the surface mirrored the rig's movement, sliding as if responding to the tilt directly. The ocean seemed alive, bending around the structure with a will of its own. I stepped back from the console, realizing some forces cannot be contained by metal and logic alone. The water beneath rippled slightly, distorting reflections and shapes in ways that defied expectation. My vision adjusted to the subtle changes, and I noticed a shadow lingering near the base of a pylon, coiled and unbroken. The tilt wasn't just movement, it was negotiation. The structure was aligning itself with something below, something massive, unseen and intelligent. Every sense screamed that interference would be catastrophic. Control's voice over the intercom urged calm, suggesting recalibration and procedural checks. I pressed my hand to the metal wall, suppressing panic while my mind raced for solutions the rule forbade. The calm water reflected the rig at a skewed angle, creating illusions that made the tilt appear more dramatic than the instruments indicated. Yet my body knew the truth, a certainty no display could convey. This wasn't about mechanics, it was about survival. I looked at the crew in the tower, aware that their confidence depended on visible leadership. I forced my voice into a measured tone, instructing them to monitor systems without intervention. Even as I spoke, I felt the rig adjust subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a predator feeling our collective heartbeat. Each tiny shift reverberated through the floor and into my chest, making me painfully aware of the weight of inaction. Restraint felt more dangerous than movement. The shadows below the water moved in response to each tilt, their shapes bending and stretching unnaturally. I realized then that our observations might be feeding them, that noticing them at all encouraged their manipulation of our environment. The ocean had become a mirror of awareness, reflecting and reacting to attention. The tilt, the shadows, and the calm were all connected in ways I could neither measure nor predict. Panic bubbled under the surface, restrained only by the rules themselves. I held my gaze low, refusing to track the rig's exact angle as I monitored control displays instead. Each flicker of movement outside told me that something immense and deliberate was beneath us, testing limits, bending the rig to its design. The shadows seemed to pulse with the tilt, forming patterns that suggested intelligence and awareness. My chest tightened, realizing that our reliance on observation might be the exact risk the rules were designed to prevent. Every instinct screamed to look, but the rule demanded restraint. The tilt grew slightly more pronounced, slow but undeniable, and I felt the tower respond beneath my boots. My hands gripped the railing as my eyes sought any familiar point of reference. Nothing anchored us, except memory and instinct. The calm water reflected warped lines and shapes, teasing clarity where none existed. And as the rig shifted once more, deliberate and measured, I understood that the rules were our only defense, and disobedience could be fatal. The tower lights dimmed briefly, shadows stretching and bending across consoles and walls as if reaching for something unseen. I froze, gripping the edge of my station, realizing immediately that Rule 10, if lights flicker in the tower while the sea remains calm, do not leave your station unattended, was no idle warning. The calm outside contrasted with the chaos within, a silent dissonance that made every movement feel magnified. Crew members whispered, trying to maintain composure, but their reflections in the glass betrayed tension I could feel pressing against my chest. Every flicker was deliberate, testing focus, patience, and restraint. I scanned the room, noting every blinking console light, every shadow that stretched longer than it should. Instruments reported stability, yet the rig had shifted multiple times, and the water below remained impossibly still. Each flicker of light seemed to align with subtle tilts, minor tremors, or shadows moving beneath the surface. My instincts told me to check every floor, to reassure the crew, but the rule forbade it. Leaving my station could invite catastrophe in ways I couldn't yet define. I tried to maintain a calm voice over the intercom, instructing the crew to hold their positions and report any anomalies immediately. Their murmurs were laced with hesitation, fear creeping into their cadence despite my attempt at normalcy. The flickering lights seemed to respond, pulses of dim and bright synchronized with the rhythm of my heartbeat. My reflection in the window, distorted with each pulse, merging with shadows below to create shapes I refused to identify. Awareness itself felt dangerous. The calm outside betrayed every expectation I had learned from years of storms and observation. The water's surface was a mirror, reflecting the rig at angles that shifted with every flicker. I kept my eyes low, focusing on logs and monitors, trying to anchor myself to tangible data. But every screen claimed stability, lying to me with sterile certainty. I realized then that rules existed precisely because the ordinary instruments could not measure the extraordinary. I imagined leaving the station, walking the tower floors to reassure others, to observe directly, but the thought made my stomach twist. The rules weren't just protocol, they were survival mechanisms, designed to prevent interference with forces beyond human comprehension. I felt the flickers again, longer now, stretching the shadows across the room like fingers testing boundaries. Each pulse demanded attention, yet acknowledging it too fully felt like surrender. I took a deep breath and pressed my hands flat against the console, grounding myself in place. Voices in the channel speculated about electrical faults and storm fatigue, oblivious to the subtleties of timing, the alignment with tilts, shadows, and waves. I wanted to correct them, to explain the rules silently, but words were powerless against the complexity of observation. The calm outside amplified the eeriness, making every movement inside feel like a response rather than a coincidence. My mind raced, trying to calculate risk while maintaining the rule, but logic had become irrelevant. Survival now depended on restraint, observation, and trust in rules that felt older than the rig itself. The flickering continued, longer, pulsing in irregular intervals, and I realized that the tower itself seemed aware of my hesitation. It wasn't the rig malfunctioning. It was responding to observation, perhaps to intention. I pressed my back to the wall, refusing to leave my station, my stomach tight with dread. Outside, the shadows beneath the water mirrored every flicker, moving as though the sea and tower were communicating in a language I could barely comprehend. The calm was deliberate, the lights deliberate, and I understood that leaving would mean losing control over what could be influenced. The reflections of my own face and the rig intertwined on the glass as another flicker stretched across the room. The pulse of light was no longer random. It seemed guided by something beneath the water, testing focus, patience, and attention simultaneously. I realized that I was the variable being measured. Every instinct screamed to move, to check, to respond, but the rule anchored me in place, and as the flicker reached its longest stretch yet, I understood that the tower, the water, and the shadows were all waiting for a single misstep. I pressed my palms against the console, trying to calm the racing of my heart, when the rig tilted subtly once more, almost imperceptibly, as though responding to my rising panic. That was when Rule 11. If the rig seems to react to your thoughts, do not speak them aloud, hit me like a cold wave. Everything I feared saying in desperation could provoke forces beyond comprehension. Every shadow beneath the water seemed to ripple in anticipation. Every flicker of light in the tower synchronized with my awareness. I wanted to call out, to explain, to reason with someone else, but the moment words formed, the rig reacted, shifting in tandem with my intent. It was a terrifying realization that even thought alone might be enough to draw attention. I sank to a crouch, eyes locked on the monitors and the reflections beyond them, trying to ground myself in the measurable. The water stretched infinitely dark below, but I could sense shapes moving with awareness. Studying our every hesitation, shadows flickered, intertwining with the rig's tilts, responding not to wind or waves, but to intention. My mind screamed to test the theory, to see if thought truly influenced the tower, but restraint gripped me tighter than fear. I understood then that the rig itself was an instrument, and I was the variable. Crew voices over the channel became uncertain. Questions half-formed and abandoned as unease rippled through them. No one knew the true scale of the anomalies, yet everyone could feel it. The subtle tilts, the flickering lights, the unearthly calm outside. Each pause, each glance, each decision seemed magnified, as though the rig, the shadows, and the water were all observing, calculating. I forced myself to stay silent, keeping thoughts buried, trying to separate observation from influence. Even breathing felt dangerous in that awareness. I imagined speaking, just a single phrase, a reassurance to myself, or a warning to someone else. But the tilt increased the instant I considered it. Subtle, precise, undeniable. Every instinct screamed to test the rule, to see if it was superstition or survival protocol. Yet the rig responded instantly, forcing me back into compliance. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, heart hammering, convinced that any spoken word could trigger consequences I could not control. The shadows below the supports moved in rhythm with the tilt, coiling and stretching, as though aware of my internal struggle. I realized that their intelligence, if it could be called that, extended beyond simple observation. They were anticipating, responding, interacting. The calm water, the rig, the lights, even my own thoughts had become part of an ecosystem I barely understood. I dared not move from my station, dared not breathe too loudly, dared not even think of what might happen next. Restraint was survival, but it carried its own weight. I tried to visualize safe sequences, actions that would allow the rig to remain balanced, without invoking response. Every calculation, every plan, seemed already anticipated, encountered by subtle movements in the structure. The shadows below shifted in synchrony, like a predator testing for weakness, testing attention. The tower trembled lightly under my palms, an almost imperceptible reminder that stability was conditional, fragile, and responsive. I realized survival required more than observation. It demanded perfect control over both mind and body. The calm outside was unnerving now, a perfect mask, hiding intentions and movements I couldn't perceive. Each shadow below, each flicker above, each tilt of the rig felt deliberate, as though the ocean itself was orchestrating every detail. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting heartbeats to anchor sanity. Even thinking about leaving the station felt dangerous, and yet every moment of stillness became an act of defiance and submission simultaneously. Awareness and restraint were no longer separate, they were inseparable. I thought about the first rule, the second, all of them, each a survival mechanism I had barely understood until now. Following them had kept me alive, but the final one, the 11th, was different. It required controlling not just my actions, but my very mind. I understood in a terrifying instant that speaking, even to myself, could trigger consequences beyond human comprehension. The rig's subtle shifts, the water's unnatural movements, the shadow's careful coordination, all demanded compliance beyond instinct. I pressed my hands harder against the console, trying to anchor both body and thought, and then, for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The rig, the shadows, the water, and even my own pulse. Silence filled the tower, yet it was a silence heavy with awareness, as if something immense and unseen had turned its focus entirely on me. I felt the weight of observation, pressing down from every angle, every depth, every reflection. I wanted to move, to speak, to breathe differently, but fear, and the rule, held me frozen. And in that unbearable stillness, I understood with absolute certainty that the final answer was waiting, just beneath the surface, watching, patient, and entirely unconcerned with whether I survived.